All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar. If you're just joining us, I'm Remy Poor and I'm a content strategist here at RadiaSoft. Our talk today is on machine learning models and classifiers in Sirepo Activait, and it will be presented by Jon Edelen. You can see his picture there in the corner. Jon is a senior research scientist here at RadiaSoft and an accelerator physicist who specializes in thermoionic cathode guns and space charge effects in low energy electron beams. He earned his PhD in accelerator physics from Colorado State University, was a Bardeen Fellow at Fermilab, and has worked on PIP2 and the Advanced Photon Source. So we'll get started here in a second. Jon, if you want to unmute and feel free to take it away.
All right, great. Thanks, Remy. Thanks everybody for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of our recent software updates with you all. If you attended my last webinar, I mainly focused on a specific application of machine learning using autoencoders and talking about anomaly detection in particle accelerators. Today, it's going to be a little bit different. I'm focusing a little bit more on showing you some of our new software tools and how we might use them to solve a few different problems, and then what you can do with those software tools. But before we get into that, I do want to talk a little bit about some context for the examples, just to sort of try to motivate it a little bit better. So I think I've showed this slide before, but if you haven't seen it, basically a lot of this work is motivated by trying to improve performance of particle accelerators. So you spend time with accelerators either operating, sending beams to experiments, using them for accelerator R&D, or just downtime. And downtime is sort of the thing we're always trying to avoid, whether it's trying to reduce scheduled maintenance time or whether it's reducing unscheduled maintenance time. And then also just accelerator R&D, if we can optimize how we run the machine when we're performing studies, then that's interesting for accelerators. And machine learning can address a wide number of these. The two topics that I'm going to talk about today, classifiers and models, surrogate models specifically, are really to help the machine during operation. So it's helping beam time for experiments, so trying to optimize the machine and make sure it's running smoothly, and then also accelerator R&D time. So the first example that I'm going to talk about is related to the photocathode RF gun at Fermilab, and this is a 6 MeV electron gun. It's a normal conducting structure. It generates electrons via ultraviolet drive laser, and it accelerates these electrons using RF fields. It's around 5 megawatts or so, and the frequency is about 1.3 gigahertz. It can operate under a range of bunch charges, and this is sort of what motivates using machine learning, because we want to be able, because the system is so flexible, it can be reconfigured in a number of different ways. So we want to be able to quickly sort of identify what kind of operating regime we're in, whether we're in a good or a bad operating regime for those particular parameters. And in some cases, we want to be able to retune the machine. So this is the template. This machine is something that we have done a lot of studies with for machine learning specifically, and today I'm going to talk about using data from the simulation of this machine to basically train different kinds of classifiers to say, okay, can we predict when the machine is going to have more or higher or lower losses, and then what kinds of classifiers are going to work best in those situations. In general, classifiers kind of fit into two sort of categories. We have just simple binary classifiers, and then we have classifiers where we have multiple different classes that we're trying to identify. For the example, for demonstrating the toolbox today, I'm going to focus on the binary classifier example. So in this case, we have 3 different tunable parameters. We have the RF amplitude and phase for powering the cavity. We have the bunch charge, and then we have the solenoid current. And the solenoid current basically affects the focusing, and if the solenoid current is not correctly tuned, then you'll have beam losses. And the idea is, can we train a classifier to quickly tell us whether or not, given these input parameters, what kind of transmission we're going to get, whether we're going to get full transmission or whether we're going to get beam loss. And this could be extended to a multi-class problem where instead of just trying to pick between the sort of high transmission case or the low transmission case, can we identify not only transmission, but whether we have good or bad beam quality, high or low energy, things like that. So that would be where we would use, that would be a multi-class data set problem. And you can use a lot of different tools for classification. You can use neural networks, so that's a common thing to do if you have a complicated data set. You can also use k-nearest neighbors, that's KNN. Logistic classifiers are very common, decision trees are common, and in the demo, I'll sort of walk through a couple of those examples. And then this is just, I mean, we ran the study on the data set and looked at decision trees, k-nearest neighbors, support vector classifiers, and generate this confusion matrix plot. And the confusion matrix is basically telling you how well you're labeling the data set with the classifier. And for the different types of classifiers, it sort of performs, doesn't always perform as well, depending on which method you're using. So for this case, the support vector machines don't work very well, and that's not super surprising. The photocathode RF guns tend to be kind of nonlinear systems, and even sort of a linear classifier like support vector machine is not going to necessarily work as well. But like a lot of these data points are clustered, heavily clustered, and you'll see that when I show them in the demo. So like a clustering tool like k-nearest neighbors might do a lot better, and then decision trees obviously are the highest performing for this particular data set. So this is just to give an overview. This is the data set that I'm going to show in the example a little bit later. But then I also want to talk a little bit about surrogate modeling. So if you saw my last webinar as well, I talked a lot about the Fermilab linac and doing anomaly detection tasks on the linac. This time I'm going to talk about generating a surrogate model. And what I mean by a surrogate model is it's a fast executing model. It could either be an analytic model or an artificial neural network or other type of machine learning model, but it basically serves as a substitute for a high fidelity simulation because that can be run in operations. And the reason why we want to do this is because for some problems, like specifically a ion linac like this, there's a lot of cavities, there's space charge because it's low energy beams, and simulating this can be challenging to do in the control room during operations, just because it's a time-consuming calculation. So what we can do though is we can run lots of simulations on high-performance computing resources offline and train a neural network to basically reproduce the results from the physics model, but tell us about what the machine is doing. And the neural network, once it's trained, runs very quickly. So instead of having to run a high-fidelity simulation, you can do the same thing with a neural network. So that's sort of the idea behind the surrogate model. And here, the inputs to the surrogate model are basically the initial conditions of the beam, whatever machine settings you have at the time, and then the location along the machine that you want to predict the outputs. You can do this as just a sort of an input-output type of problem where you say, given for a chunk of the machine, just tell me the beam at the exit of the machine. But one of the nice things about training on the position as an input is that not only do you get to look at the beam envelope along the machine from what the simulation is saying, is that you also just get a lot more examples for the neural network. So you only added one additional input parameter, and if you're dumping the beam distribution at a lot of positions along the beam line, you've just expanded your data set by, it could be up to a factor of 100, depending on how many times you're saving the information, which really helps the neural network to learn what's going on in the machine. And I'll show that in the example later, what happens when you train the architecture with a bigger data set like that. So, I mean, we've been looking at surrogate modeling for a while. It's of interest to the community as a whole. I think there's a lot of people in the accelerator community that are trying to build surrogate models for their particular machines. We've been interested in both predicting beam parameters along the accelerator and also in doing distributions. So if you given an input distribution, tell me what the output distribution is going to look like. And this is super useful if you want to pass that to another simulation, or if you want to pass that to another surrogate model. You can basically create a modular neural network based simulation of your machine. And it executes a lot faster than your particle tracking simulation. And that which is useful for tuning and for operations. And then another thing that we're specifically interested in, a lot of people are interested in too, is how well you can move these surrogate models around. So you train, this is one of the criticisms of machine learning, is that you have a very specific solution for a particular data set, and you want to say, okay, well, how do I apply that to my new data set, and can you apply it, and if you can, what sort of how well does that work? So with transfer learning, you're basically training a model on a data set, and then you're saying, instead of starting with random initial weights, you're taking those weights from the trained data set and then retraining it on a new data set. So we've been studying this for a little while on the Fermilab linac as well. And here you're looking at an example of, we trained a model on tank 2, and then we said, okay, taking data from tanks 3 and 4, I want to retrain that model and see how well the neural network performs if we retrain on the new data set. So on the top right is a prediction of the RMS beam parameters as a function of position for tank 3 before we retrain. This is using the tank 2 model just out of the box. And of course, it doesn't agree very well, but it is sort of, the parameters are at the same scale. So with the information that was learned by training on tank 2 is sort of somewhat useful for telling us what's going on in tank 3, but it's not accurate in terms of quantitative information. But once you retrain it, then it does reproduce the RMS beam parameters very well. And then on the bottom left, we're looking at the training curves. So the blue and the green curves are if we start training from scratch and then continue training for 2000 epochs. And then the red curve is if we start training on a different tank and then start retraining on like tank 3 or tank 4 in this case. You see it, not only does it train a lot faster, but the end result is overall better. And we've been looking at transfer learning for the image data too. This is just another example of showing how transfer learning can help you to sort of give you a starting point that's better than just starting from scratch. Okay, so that's just some context. I wanted to sort of get through that and then move into showing you the software tools and what's available right now and how you can use that to solve some problems. Okay, so if you go to Sirepo.com, under supported codes, we now have this machine learning toolbox, which is available. And it brings you to this landing page. And from here, you can start off by creating a new data set. And I'll start off with the classifier example. So we call this classifier, and that generates sort of the template. There's two different application modes right now, regression and classification. And I'm going to go through both of them, but we're starting with classification. And I have a bunch of data files in here from previous examples, but I am going to upload a new data file. Once you upload the data file, you can choose between different scalars. Sometimes for classifiers, you may or may not want to rescale your data depending on what you're doing. I think it's generally sort of a good idea to rescale your data whenever you're applying any kind of fitting or machine learning or whatever, just to sort of, especially when you have like for these injector simulations, there's some of the parameters are on a very different scale from one another. So I think it's useful to rescale the data, and it makes it easier to train the models. And then in the tool, you can sort of pick which one you want. I'm going to stick with the robust scaler. So the data file is loaded, and you can pick through which ones are your inputs and which ones are your outputs. If you have header information in the CSV file, that'll show up in the column names, right? I don't have any header information for this data set. I know what's in there. The first 4 columns are the RF amplitude and phase, the bunch charge, and the solenoid current. And then the last column is just a binary column. And they don't necessarily pop up, but you can view all the different parameters. You just click show and you can look at what's in the data file. It's just gonna, right now, all it's gonna do is show you a sequence of points. So this is just, you can zoom in, scroll around, get a feel for what the data looks like. We're planning to implement some more features in this part of the toolbox that allow you to plot columns against each other, but for now you just look at each column individually. So now we've selected which columns are the inputs and outputs, and we can go to the partition tab, which splits the data into training and testing. And this is just going to show you some histograms of the data set. The idea here is to see how well you're sampling the training and validation or training and testing data. If you see any sort of anomalies here, you say, oh, well, we're really undersampling this one region, or we're really undersampling it in the testing set, or here, like the output, output of the class of the binary is, there's a lot more of it's an asymmetric data set, so it's not evenly distributed between the 0 and 1 binary. Stuff like that, you can just see that pretty easily with the partitioning tool. And then moving on to the classification tool. So here you can pick between a few different classifiers. A lot of these are all just sort of standard scikit-learn tools, but you don't have to remember the syntax. You can just select one. If you select decision tree, for example, we don't have any of the tunable parameters implemented, but you don't need to worry about that for just getting started. And you can train the model, and then it'll output these nice diagnostics that show you the confusion matrix for the decision tree, and then the metrics. You can switch to k-nearest neighbors, for example, and in that case, you can pick to scan over a range of number of clusters. So we can choose a range of 1 to 50. And if you pick the range and you train it, we'll output the diagnostics for the performance as a function of the k numbers. That'll pop up in a second here. And then it'll show the same confusion matrix for the optimal number of clusters. So this is basically the mean error as a function of the number of clusters. So that'll tell you how many clusters you should be using. And this is the confusion matrix for the optimal, which in this case was the most. It's not always going to be just the most number of clusters. And in fact, even for this data set, normally it's fewer clusters, but I have heavily downsampled it for the purposes of the demo, just so that we would get plots that are produced relatively quickly. So then once you've sort of played around with this, I mean, all of these, you can save the data files, you can save the images for any of these outputs. And if you sort of are, okay, you set something up and you're kind of happy with it, or it's just you've sort of gotten started with it, but you want to go further, you can export the code as a zip file. And then you can go to Jupyter. You can upload the data to Jupyter. So this is jupyter.radiasoft.org, which is our Jupyter server. And you can run any of the code that's generated from Sirepo. All of the same libraries are installed. So hi. And if you want to just look at the code and see what's running, some of this stuff in the beginning is pre-processing and loading data and scaling, and then the actual code for the classifier training is down here. So this is saying, okay, actually running the k-nearest neighbors classifier, and then this is finding the best classifier from the scan, and then this is calculating the outputs. So for the k-neighbors classifiers, for a lot of these other classifiers, the syntax is fairly simple, but you can just export it, and then you can, from there, you can expand upon it and do quite a bit. Okay, the other example I wanted to show is on the regression. I think there's a little bit more going on there, so I'll try to go through that slowly. We have two different data sets for the surrogate model, so I'm going to start off by showing the aggressively downsampled data set, and then I'll show you what happens when we go to the the higher sample rate data set. And again, I'm going to apply the robust scaler. So there's quite a few parameters in this data set. Again, I don't have the columns labeled, but there's basically the inputs are the two, it's a single DTL, so there's an RF amplitude and a phase. Then there's initial beam parameters, and then the position, and then the output is the beam, the sort of 6-dimensional phase space parameters at that position. I mean, and I can show these, but it's not, I'll show one of them. So I think in the partitioning, it's a little bit easier to see how the data sets are being sampled. So for the regression task, you have two different options for partitioning. The first option is just standard random splitting, and then it'll show you these histograms, and you can look at the histograms for all of the inputs and outputs. And sort of right off the bat, that there's definitely tails in this distribution. There's areas where you're really going to have a hard time learning because it's just very undersampled. And you'll see in the next tab why that, how that becomes a problem. We also have a select ranges tool. In the select ranges tool, you can basically choose where in the data set you want to sample the training, validation, and tests. The reason for doing this is if you, in some cases, you have a data set where you want to specifically exclude a range where maybe it's more challenging to measure and you want to be able to interpolate over that range, or you want to see if you can train your model to extrapolate or see how well your model extrapolates by cutting off a range on the end of the distribution. We're still sort of fine-tuning this range selection tool, but for now you can say, I want to save this chunk for training, testing, validation, or training and testing, and you can pick which chunk of the data is doing which, and then that will generate the training data accordingly. Okay. So then in the regression tab, this is basically where you generate a model. All these no report generated just because the model hasn't been trained yet, so there's nothing to show. So that'll go away once we train the model. Right now you can implement a neural network, and you can implement it using a few different layers. These are all the different layers that are implemented at the moment. Basically for this one, I'll just pick a bunch of densely connected layers. I'll add in some Gaussian noise, which is helpful for overfitting. And you can kind of see how this works. And then for each one of the layers, you can choose which activation functions you want to use. For this example, I'm just going to stick with the rectified linear units, but it's just pick from the drop-down menu which one you want to use. You can go through and change how many nodes you want in your network. You can change how much Gaussian noise you have, all fairly easily. And then once you've sort of satisfied with your network architecture, You can pick the optimizer settings. Again, we have a range of the built-in optimizers available. Just pick which one you want to work with. Atom is a very nice way to get started. I use that for a lot of the problems that I'm working on. And then just mean squared error is fairly effective, but some cases it's not really what you want to use. So you can choose from a range of different loss functions as well. So once you start training, it'll show an output of the loss as a function of epoch, and that'll pop up in a second here. So you can see that the validation loss is just climbing fairly aggressively, which is we're basically overfitting quite a lot. And once this will be finished in a second, and I'll show you the validation plots at the bottom. Yeah, so like some of these, okay, we're learning something, but in a lot of these, it's just not only is it not fitting, it's also just horribly overfitting. So like I said before, this is sort of aggressively downsampled. We can go to a example where I'm using just 10 times more data points. So essentially the first data set, I just took I downsampled by a factor of 10, and now I'm taking all of those data. And I'll skip the plotting, partitioning, and we'll just go right to the regression. So we have a new data set, but the model can stay the same. You don't need to rebuild the model. You can just go ahead and start training again, and then it'll train on the new data set. I have made an error. Apologize about that. Yeah, if your output layer has to be equal to the dimensionality of your outputs. So that's something that right now you have to do manually. It's sort of a planned improvement to the interface that you don't have to do that manually, so that it just automatically generates the output layer to match the output dimensionality of your data set. But right now you have to make sure that that's correct, otherwise it'll give you the error that I just got. And as you can see, it's no longer aggressively overfitting quite as bad as it was before. Still not great. Probably can increase the number of data points, play around with how we're splitting the data up. And then you can, if you sort of say, oh, well, this isn't really doing what I want to do, you can just stop it in the middle, and then you can make changes. So we can stop it. We can go back to partition and say, let's use a random partition instead of select ranges partition, and then we can start over. So you don't have to wait for it to finish training. And we can start it again. You can see right away that made a pretty significant difference on the learning curve for this particular model. So these types of things can have an effect. So you got to make sure that you're being careful. If you do range selection for your data set, know that that's going to have an effect on how easy it's going to be to train the model. And if you just do random sampling, then it might be easier, it might not be easier. It just sort of depends on the data set that you're looking at. I'm not going to let this run all the way to the end. but the output plots look very similar. For this particular case, with the increased number of data points, the network learns the relationships a lot easier. As you can see, compared to the previous round, we had a lot of overfitting. Now it's not really overfitting at all. So, and then the same thing with the classifier example. You can export this as a zip file, and then you can pull this into Jupyter. And as with the same thing with the classifier, this is the bottom, basically gives you the Keras syntax that you would need to train to run that model. It's not super complicated for this particular model, but the idea here is that if you're using the tool, one, you get these nice diagnostics, and two, you sort of don't have to remember all the orders and things. And it's a nice way to get started with doing this. And then at a certain point you say, okay, I want to do some more. I want to expand out into a new area, or just something a little more complicated. Then you have the template to go ahead and do that. Okay, that's all I really had to show for now. I'm happy to take questions at this time.
Great, thank you so much, John. That was a great presentation. If you guys joined us a little bit late, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. We also have Stephen Webb on the line here, who is another research scientist at RadiaSoft, who's going to help answer these questions with John. We do have a few that already came in. First one, a little bit about logistics, about the slides. We will be making the slides available after the talk, and that'll be sent out along with the recording when that is finished. Stephen, you want to make sure you're off mute, and then you can start.
Am I off mute?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So Eric Stern had a question regarding transfer learning. If you train with one set of initial conditions, can it reproduce parameters for a different set of initial conditions? I'm not 100% clear on this question. John, do you have, because it sounds like this could go a number of ways.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding it, you're saying that you're retraining it you're retraining the same, like a model that's the same system, but just with different initial conditions, or is it a model of a new system that has different initial conditions? Or are you talking about initial conditions of the network itself?
Right. So Eric, if you could clarify that in the Q&A chat window, that would we can get back to it.
Perfect.
While we wait for Eric, Yuan Gao had a question. How would you deal with inputs with different frequencies?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you're just going to use like a standard dense sort of regular feed-forward network, you probably could start by just oversampling where you don't, if you have, you could downsample one of them to be at the same rate as the other one so that you have sort of all the same sample rate of all your data, or you could upsample one of your data sets so that you have all the same data set. I mean, there's things you can do, I think, with other types of architectures where you can handle different sampling rates. I'm assuming you're talking about, like, when you say frequencies, you mean like the sampling rate of the data set. But typically, like when I'm working with data from an operational machine, I'll downsample to meet the lowest sample rate. And if that's just really not working that well, then I'll consider upsampling in regions where I don't have data for a particular diagnostic.
Great. All right. If you guys have any other questions, again, just use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Wait for a few more to come in here.
Yeah, so John, I had a question about the Sirepo interface since
Sure.
you're the expert on that. What kinds of neural networks can you handle? Is it just the feed-forward artificial neural networks, or is there a plan for things like LSTMs or recurrent neural networks?
Yeah, so what's there now is just the feed-forward networks, but for sure, the plan is to incorporate LSTMs, convolutional neural networks, Bayesian models, things like that. But that's going to be released at a later date. Right now, it's just those the sort of standard feed-forward network.
Great. Eric clarified his question. His comment was, when I make a surrogate model set up one way, I'm wondering how useful that is when my machine parameters change.
Right. Yeah. So I think that that would be a great thing for transfer learning, because you've already trained a surrogate model on a region of a particular parameter space. So it's essentially like with the study that we're doing on the linac, it's similar in the sense that you're changing the machine, but the parameters are sort of in a similar range. But like it's the same concept. I think you'd still see a benefit in applying transfer learning as opposed to starting from scratch. You just retrain on a data set with new machine parameters. It may just work if it's, I mean, depending on where your new parameters are relative to your training parameters, like it might not be as bad as you think it's going to be just out the box.
Yeah, so I guess in this case, we should clarify that your machine parameters would have to be part of your input data for that to be the case.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
If you're just training on one set of machine parameters in a variety of initial conditions,
right,
then yeah, you could probably do transfer learning. But if you're training over a range of accelerator parameters, you might not even need to do transfer learning.
Right.
All righty. Anyone else have any more questions? Looks like they're slowing down, so we can take a few more before we wrap up today. All righty. Well, that is definitely fine. I think we'll probably close up there. If you guys do have any questions after we end the webinar, you're always welcome to reach out to us. John put his email at the beginning of the presentation, but you can also email us or contact us through our website. And again, you will receive a follow-up email with the recording of the webinar and the slides and all of that after the fact. So yeah, I just want to finish by thanking you guys for your participation today, and keep an eye out for future webinars. We usually do these about once a month, and you can track those new things on our social channels or even through our email mailing list. All right, John, Stephen, thank you guys so much for being here today and doing this presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Remy. Thanks, John. And thanks everybody for attending.
All right, thanks guys. Have a great week.